Good afternoon, everybody. Today, the government of Libya announced the death of Muammar Gaddafi.
Why do you think they killed him? You think they killed him because he killed his people? Hell no. They killed him because, listen to me real good, you touched my nerve with that question. Did you know that in Libya, nobody's homeless? Listen, everybody in Libya has either a home or an apartment. They call it a flat. Did you know education in Libya is free from kindergarten through college? And did you know that if a Libyan wanted to come to America to be educated, the government in Libya paid for their education? Did you know that? I was there when he opened a $500 million hospital with 18 theaters for operation. I was there, and we went when he was making their own medicines. See? This was a man that gave free medical attention to all the citizens of Libya, and if Libya did not offer that kind of medical attention, they could fly anywhere in the world and get it, and the Libyan government would pay for it. Did you know that? No, you didn't. Did you know that from the oil money, every Libyan citizen got a stipend every year? And did you know that that man had no debt? Everything in his country was paid for. See? Now when you got a man that did that for an African nation and was trying to do that for all Africa, how do you think Europe felt about that? Well, I was with Muammar Gaddafi when Gaddafi insurged in 1999 advanced coming out of the OAU to the African Union with a vision of the United States of Africa. Muammar Gaddafi spent, listen to me, billions of dollars to create the African Union. Did you know that Gaddafi gave $300 million and the other African nations gave $100 million to put up a satellite so that we who call Africa don't have to go through Europe to get to Africa? And Europe was getting $500 million a year just by our telephone calls to the continent. Now we can call directly to Africa, and that $500 million is in the hand of African people. Did you know that Muammar Gaddafi was setting up an African development bank with $70 billion in the African Development Bank from Libyan oil money? That we would not have to borrow money from the IMF and the World Bank at these exorbitant rates. Zero interest under Islamic non-usury teachings. I just left St. Kitts, and in the island of St. Kitts, he was going to set up a Caribbean Development Bank. He told the Prime Minister there, and he was going to put $1 billion in that bank for Caribbean development.
Muammar Gaddafi was pulled from a drain pipe, tortured, and sodomized with a bayonet. He was stripped to the waist and suffered a gunshot wound to the head without mercy, lying in a pool of his own blood. These were Gaddafi's final moments in the hands of rebel captors, supported by Western forces, after this fleeing convoy was hit by drones reportedly supplied by the West. Once his captors confirmed his death, they used his lifeless body for photographs, yanking his head by the hair, Such treatment would have been condemned by the West if it happened to one of their own citizens, let alone a head of state. Gaddafi's assassination and brutal treatment were widely celebrated and broadcasted. For the first time in 42 years, Libya no longer had to fear Gaddafi. His death marked the definitive end of his regime, and few mourned his passing. More than a decade later, Libyans and the entire African continent understand more clearly why the West wanted Gaddafi gone at any cost. Even if it meant disgracing him alive and dead, the reason remains the same. Africa must not be united, and Africa must never be free. Gaddafi was heard saying this before he was dragged towards an ambulance, where he died from bullet wounds during the drive to Misrata, according to Abdul Jalil, a doctor who accompanied his body. In Cairo, Egypt, Al Jazeera continued its live coverage of a day of mass protest, called a Day of Rage, showing crowds trying to overturn a police vehicle into the Nile River amidst tear gas. On CNN, young Kenyans demonstrated for their rights with flags and banners. The video highlights how the West conspired to hinder a united Africa. To support this work, viewers are encouraged to like, share, and subscribe for more revealing content. After Tripoli fell to the opposition National Transitional Council (NTC) in August 2011, Gaddafi and his family fled the Libyan capital. Early on October 20, 2011, Gaddafi, his army chief Abubakar Yunus Jaber, his security chief Mansur Dal, and a group of loyalists attempted to escape in a convoy of 75 vehicles. A Royal Air Force Panavia Tornado on a reconnaissance mission spotted the convoy moving rapidly after NATO forces intercepted a satellite phone call made by Gaddafi. NATO aircraft then attacked 21 of the vehicles, destroying one. An American Predator drone, controlled from a base near Las Vegas, fired the first missiles at the convoy, hitting its target about 3 kilometers west of Sirte. Shortly after, French Air Force Mirage 2000D fighter jets continued the bombing. The NATO strikes immobilized much of the convoy and killed dozens of loyalist fighters. Following the initial strike, the convoy split into several groups, with the subsequent strike destroying 11 more vehicles. Rebel units on the ground also attacked the convoy. Several videos related to Gaddafi's death were shown on television and circulated on the internet. The events began hours earlier, around 8:00 a.m. on Thursday in Gaddafi's hometown of Sirte, when rebels launched what they hoped would be the final offensive against the remaining Gaddafi loyalists. An American drone operated from Las Vegas alerted NATO after spotting the convoy of 80 cars fleeing south from Sirte. French fighter jets responded with an airstrike, taking out 2 vehicles. It is unclear if they hit Gaddafi's car, but when rebels arrived, they told BBC's Gabriel Gatehouse that they found Gaddafi hiding in a drainage pipe. They discovered him just before noon and pulled him out of the hole. One fighter claimed that Gaddafi asked, "What did I do to you?" before being shot. The fatal shot was reportedly fired by a man proudly showing off Gaddafi's gold gun. Rebels reportedly propped Gaddafi on the hood of a car, parading him through the streets. One man was heard saying, "We want him alive, we want him alive," before Gaddafi was dragged off the hood towards an ambulance. Gaddafi died in the ambulance. U.S. military officials confirmed that a U.S. military Predator drone fired a Hellfire missile at Gaddafi's 15-vehicle convoy. Additionally, a NATO warplane also fired a rocket at the convoy. Several vehicles were struck or disabled, causing the rest to scatter. Gaddafi was apparently in or near one of the vehicles hit and made his way to a nearby drainage pipe along the highway, where rebel captors eventually found him and took him into custody. A video showed him alive in the custody of rebel forces before he reportedly died in an ambulance en route from Sirte. These Predator drones were primarily used for surveillance, so it's likely that the U.S. military knew Gaddafi was in the convoy when they fired upon it. This raises questions about U.S. claims that they were not specifically targeting Gaddafi. The West, including then U.S. President Barack Obama, appeared to gloat over Gaddafi's death. This wasn't the first assassination attempt on Gaddafi by the West and its European allies. On April 15, 1986, the United States Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps carried out airstrikes named Operation El Dorado Canyon against Libya in retaliation for the West Berlin discotheque bombing 10 days earlier, for which then U.S. President Ronald Reagan blamed Gaddafi. There were suspicions and controversy surrounding the incident, with claims from Libya suggesting it was a deliberate act against them. The airstrikes resulted in 45 Libyan soldiers and officials being casualties, and 15 to 30 Libyan civilians were killed. One of the reported deaths was of a baby girl, claimed to be Gaddafi's daughter Hannah Gaddafi, though there are doubts about her death and even her existence. Despite being the target and present in the compound during the attack, Gaddafi survived. Africa, from the north to the south, east to the west, and central regions, has not experienced prolonged peace since the era of conquest and the slave trade. The infamous Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European countries partitioned and divided Africa among themselves, exacerbated this instability. This conference, often seen as a grave injustice and a violation of human rights, gathered Europeans to plot the division of Africa, accelerating the colonial conquest process. The conference aimed to achieve three main objectives. First, it recognized the territory claimed by King Leopold II as his private property, which is now known as a country with its own indigenous people and landowners, a shocking notion of claiming another's land as private property. Second, it acknowledged some existing territorial claims in different parts of Africa. The third and most significant outcome was establishing a method for Europeans to claim and annex any unaccounted territories in Africa. This led to a continuous cycle of internal and inter-border crises in Africa, often influenced by the hidden hands of Europe, America, and in recent times, Russia and China. In the first and second objectives of the Berlin Conference, the elements were starkly clear in a pictorial illustration. Despite being a conference about Africa, it took place in Berlin, Germany, without a single African present. Only 2 attendees had ever set foot on the continent, which is about 3 times larger than Europe. Instead, the room was filled with European men representing 12 European countries, plus an American representative and one from the Ottoman Empire. A gigantic map of Africa dominated the room because these men had tasked themselves with dividing Africa among their respective countries. Before and after the Berlin Conference, the cruelty and gruesomeness inflicted on Africa were unimaginable. The continent was viewed as a personal and national conquest by these powers, a mindset that continued into the 21st century with even more disastrous consequences. Anyone or any nation pushing for a united Africa faced severe repercussions, often fatal. Examples include the brutal assassination of leaders like former Libyan ruler Muammar Gaddafi, who vigorously pushed for African unification. The methods of control and disruption have been extensive. The proliferation of arms and ammunition, funding and equipping of insurrections and rebellions, harboring dissidents and enemies of states, and using international media and propaganda to misinform, disinform, and amplify crises. These actions have impoverished the continent directly and indirectly. While claiming to help, Western institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund (IMF) impose policies that set African nations and governments against one another. This has been witnessed recently in Ghana, Nigeria, and the ongoing situation in Kenya. This sense of ownership and control over Africa has led to a continuous cycle of conflict and poverty, with external forces manipulating internal dynamics to maintain their influence and interests. All these were changes that the late Libyan ruler, Muammar Gaddafi, wanted to achieve with the united African entity called the African Authority. The West, understanding the implications, did not want to let go of their cash cow. Gaddafi likely sealed his fate at the end of the 2010 African Union (AU) summit in Kampala, Uganda, where he reiterated that his dream of a United States of Africa was still alive. He saw the summit as another step toward this objective. Gaddafi had long advocated for an African unity government, arguing it was the only way for Africa to develop without Western interference. However, many African states considered the idea impractical and believed it would encroach on their sovereignty. The West was particularly apprehensive because the push for African unity came from a North African state and a leader as influential as Gaddafi. The prospect of a united Africa became more tangible, especially with reports that Gaddafi had mined tons of gold to back a future African currency. The West, armed with intelligence, had no doubt that Gaddafi could achieve this. He had secured the goodwill of several African countries through millions of dollars in aid, and heavyweights like Nigeria and Ghana traditionally supported the ideology. It was only a matter of defining the technicalities and modalities over the next few summits for the African Authority to be realized. Thus, the ultimate solution to stop the momentum was to eliminate Gaddafi. As with others before him, propaganda and engineered insurrections were necessary cover-ups. This was similar to the fate of Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president, who was overthrown in a coup with help from the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Burkina Faso's president Thomas Sankara, Sylvanus Olympio, Togo's first president, and many others were assassinated for their anti-imperialist stance and efforts to promote Africa's self-sufficiency. At that time in Libya's history, the country and its citizens were the envy of the world, enjoying better social welfare packages than many in Europe and America. For instance, Libya had no electricity bill for its citizens, showcasing the significant benefits under Gaddafi's rule. Electricity came free of charge to all citizens in Libya. Additionally, there were no interest rates on loans as the banks were state-owned, and by law, loans to citizens had 0% interest. Gaddafi promised not to buy a house for his parents until every Libyan owned a home. All newlywed couples received 60,000 dinars from the government to buy their own apartments and start their families. Education and medical treatment were free, leading to a literacy rate increase from 25% to 83% during his reign. Libyans who wanted to live on farms received free household appliances, seeds, and livestock. If medical treatment wasn't available in Libya, the state funded treatment abroad with over $2,300 for accommodation and travel. The government financed 50% of the cost if you bought a car, and gasoline was priced at $0.14 per liter. Libya had no external debt, and its reserves were $150 billion, now frozen worldwide. The government paid the average salary to unemployed graduates, and part of oil sales was directly deposited into citizens' bank accounts. Mothers received $5,000 upon giving birth. 4 loaves of bread cost $0.15. Additionally, 25% of Libyans held university diplomas. Gaddafi also implemented the world's largest irrigation project, known as the Great Man-Made River, to ensure water availability in the desert. Despite these benefits, the West demonized Gaddafi, labeling him a dictator. Many commentators later questioned what democracy was if these benefits were considered dictatorial. The West misled the Libyans, who now regret their actions. Libya is currently divided between rival governments, and the insurgent group ISIS had seized parts of Sirte until recently driven out by government forces. A resident remarked that the current period is worse than the previous regime, expressing hope for national reconciliation and unity for a better future. The West realized that Gaddafi's efforts to unite Africa couldn't be ignored, similar to how the transformation from the Organization of African Unity, OAU, to the African Union, AU, initially slipped by them. This transformation had its first move in Sirte, a major city in Gaddafi's Libya, the same city where he was eventually murdered. Western powers, especially in Europe, saw Gaddafi's push for a united Africa as a serious threat. They understood that the formation of a united African body would spell doom for their long-standing control over the continent. By the time Gaddafi held the African Union's rotating chairmanship in 2009, he used his influence to push for the organization's small executive body to be granted enhanced powers and remodeled as the African Authority. When asked about this proposal during the summit, Gaddafi mentioned that studies were ongoing and not yet finished, indicating that the initiative might be completed at the next summit or after. Some African leaders, however, expressed reluctance to cede sovereignty to any African bloc so soon after gaining independence from colonial rulers. The West's fears were heightened because Gaddafi's idea had sympathetic responses from some African states. His reputation as a champion of the developing world and the millions of dollars in aid his oil-exporting countries spent in Africa bolstered his cause. Despite the dangers his push for a united Africa posed to him, Gaddafi remained undeterred. His efforts were notably strong at the 2011 AU summit. Perhaps Gaddafi's most daring attempt came in the lead-up to the 2007 African Union summit held in Accra, Ghana. Speaking at a rally at the University of Ghana on the eve of the summit, Gaddafi stated that AU leaders had not yet achieved the dream of unity voiced half a century ago by Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, a founding father of African independence. Gaddafi emphasized that for Africa, it was a matter of to be or not to be. Accra was the last stop in a week-long road trip by Gaddafi to the summit, traveling through the West African capitals of Bamako, Conakry, Freetown, and Abidjan. Gaddafi's fate was ultimately sealed, as the West ensured his assassination just about a year after the 2011 AU summit. The possibility of a united African body posed too great a threat to their control over the continent, and they acted to eliminate the driving force behind this vision. At each stop, Gaddafi held rallies calling for the establishment of a United States of Africa. He emphasized that Africa needed one voice and one army. How can an African country face a united Europe, negotiate with the USA, Japan, or China? He asked. If we have a United States of Africa, then Africa can be on an equal footing and negotiate with them. Gaddafi argued that uniting the continent would also help staunch the flow of migrants to Europe. Obviously, the West did not want any of these goals to be achieved. Throughout the 1990s, African leaders debated the need to amend the Organization of African Unity, OAU, structures to address the challenges of a changing world. In 1999, the OAU heads of state and government issued the CERT Declaration, calling for the establishment of a new African Union AU. The vision for the AU was to build on the OAU's work by establishing a body that could accelerate the process of integration in Africa, support the empowerment of African states in the global economy, and address the multifaceted social, economic, and political problems facing the continent. In total, 4 summits were held leading up to the official launch of the AU. 1. CERT Summit 1999 adopted the CERT Declaration, calling for the establishment of the AU. 2. Loma Summit 2000 adopted the AU Constitutive Act. 3. Lusaka Summit 2001 drew the roadmap for the implementation of the AU. 4. Durban Summit 2002 launched the AU and convened its first assembly of heads of state and government. Many structures from the OAU were carried forward into the AU. Similarly, many of the OAU's core commitments, decisions, and strategy frameworks continue to shape AU policies. However, while the footprint of the OAU remains strong, the AU Constitutive Act and protocols established a significant number of new structures, both at the level of major organs and through a range of new technical and subsidiary bodies. Since the establishment of the African Union AU in 2002, many of its committees have evolved, and some are still under development. The death of Muammar Gaddafi and the turmoil that has befallen Libya have raised questions about whether the dream of a united Africa has been extinguished. The risks faced by anyone advocating for African unity suggest that few leaders may be willing to champion the cause if it puts their countries in jeopardy. The concept of a United States of Africa, or a more unified Africa in general, has been debated for years with varying perspectives on its feasibility and desirability. Several reasons explain the resistance or skepticism towards this idea. Historically, Western powers have been deeply involved in Africa, including through colonization and exploitation. Critics argue that a strong, unified Africa could challenge the economic and political interests of certain Western countries or multinational corporations operating in the region. A more united Africa could disrupt existing global power structures, potentially shifting trade relationships, access to resources, and geopolitical influence. This possibility might concern those who benefit from the current global order. There are also concerns about stability and governance. Africa is a continent marked by a rich diversity of cultures, languages, and political systems. Skeptics worry about the practical challenges of uniting such a varied region under a single political entity and managing its governance effectively. Concerns about governance, stability, and the potential for internal conflicts are significant when discussing the idea of a United States of Africa. Critics argue that advocating for such a united Africa could be perceived as imposing a specific vision of unity on the continent, potentially infringing on national sovereignty and the right to self-determination. They worry that a top-down approach to unity might overlook the diverse needs and aspirations of individual African countries. These concerns are part of a broader debate about the desirability and feasibility of a united Africa, which involves complex considerations of history, politics, economics, culture, and governance. While some observers blame Africans themselves for the lack of unity, citing issues like ethnic diversity, competition, and power struggles, others argue that the interference and exploitative interests of Western powers have played a significant role in preventing unity. Patrice Lumumba, the first prime minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, highlighted that colonial powers were primarily interested in Africa's resources and were guided by their own interests, often disregarding the continent's well-being. Given Africa's vast size, diverse population, and tribal fragmentation, compounded by the historical impact of Western colonialism, a full unification comparable to the United States of America seems practically impossible. However, a hybrid approach, as suggested by Nigerian businessman Aliko Dangote, could offer a way forward. Dangote has noted the challenges faced by Africans traveling with Nigerian passports and hinted at the potential for an African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, to facilitate the movement of goods and services across the continent. This could represent a step toward greater integration without requiring complete political unification. An hour ago, I expressed to President Kagame my frustration about the difficulties I face as an investor wanting to make Africa great. I have to apply for 35 different visas for my travels, which is time-consuming and frustrating. I mentioned to him that if everyone were treated the same, I would understand better. However, it is particularly annoying that someone with a French passport can travel more freely than I can with a Nigerian passport. For instance, a French passport holder does not need 35 visas to move around while I do. Similarly, citizens of Francophone countries in Africa have easier movement within their fellow Francophone nations. For example, flying from Kenya to Namibia can cost the same as flying to Thailand. This highlights the challenges faced by Africans traveling within a continent that has more borders than any other, making it difficult for entrepreneurs to establish businesses outside their own countries. The introduction of an African passport in the near future could provide new investment opportunities and simplify travel across the continent. Additionally, African countries often struggle to secure fair trade deals with nations outside the continent due to lower negotiating power. With the free flow of trade, Africa could create one of the largest trading blocs in the world, potentially even surpassing existing ones. This vision aligns with the goals Gaddafi once pursued, including the idea of adopting a single currency and moving away from the CFA franc used in former French colonies. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, is a step toward this goal, aiming to ease trade and economic integration across Africa. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, marks a significant step toward greater integration across the continent, allowing for the free movement of people, goods, and services within Africa. Goods with more than 60% value added at an African origin can move across borders without tariffs. This initiative saw 44 out of 54 African Union members sign the agreement in 2018, and it officially commenced when 22 countries ratified it. Efforts should be intensified to encourage more countries to join the AfCFTA and to enhance the value content of traded goods. Visa restrictions and the implementation of a single currency, akin to the euro, pose challenges, but as history shows, monumental tasks like these take time. With continued progress over the next decade, Africa may achieve greater unity and freedom from external control, realizing the aspirations of many who have fought for this vision. We hope you found this segment informative. Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. We always appreciate hearing from you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. Thank you for watching.